I just want to do God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I'm Randy Robinson. Good to have you with us here today. We're going to talk about something that really impacts every single one of us. And if you are a Christian, then this is what you are called to do today, tomorrow, on a daily basis. And I got to say, I was raised in a church that they did something, and I don't think they did it on purpose. So I will give them that caveat. But we had this idea that you had missionaries, and they were special people that went out and shared the gospel. And we had evangelists. They were special people that went out and preached in our cities. And then over here, my priorities were God first, and then family, and then depending on who you talk to, either my work or my country, something like that. And I remember there was this point where I was young, and I thought, that's kind of weird, because shouldn't God be in your family, and God be in your work, and God be in your hobbies or whatever? I mean, do we separate like that? And again, completely unintentional. I think if you challenged anybody in my early churches, they would be like, well, yeah, of course. But we do this. At least I did this. Maybe you have too. I had this separation of life and God, and nobody would ever teach you to do that in the church, but we kind of tend to go there. But yet we are all called to do something that today's guest refers to as God's work in the world. What is God's work in the world? Well, that's what Geoff Peters is talking about. And in fact, he has a book that is a modern-day parable. A parable is just a story to point to a greater truth. And this is the book. It's called The Family Business. The author is Geoff Peters. He is part of the leadership at an organization called Operation Mobilization. We'll talk a bit about that. But this is a story to help tell a greater story that is really your story. So we invite you to be a part of the conversation, and thrilled to have you wherever you're at. By the way, if we are all on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, and lightsource.com. So if you miss us on one channel, you can always follow us and catch us on the others. But Geoff, great to have you today. Welcome to Life Today Live.
Randy, thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
So I guess the first question I would have is when you're trying to communicate, a spiritual point, a truth, why do it in parable form?
Randy, for me, probably ever since I was a little kid, I've always been drawn to parables. They're easy to remember. They are something that you tend to come back to multiple times, especially, I don't know how many times I've read the various parables that Christ laid out in the Gospels, but I feel like there's so many times I go back to the same parable and I feel like I'm learning something new. And so we felt like, as we're trying to get across this idea of you were made for God's purpose in the world, sometimes you can just say it straight. Sometimes through a parable, you can present it in a way that allows people to connect the dots for themselves. And so that's what we're trying to do through the family business.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the parable itself. Give us the framework for the story without giving away the whole story, because we want people to go get the book.
Yeah, we don't want to give away, no spoilers, right? The story itself takes place in Iowa, and Jesse is a father of 5 adult children. He's also the owner of what has become a small to growing hardware store franchise that has just developed a phenomenal reputation over the years. And one Memorial Day weekend, as he's getting up there in age, he calls all of his children back to the family home and says, kids, I'd love to extend this invitation. I want all of you to join our family business. And the story unfolds from that point as each of the 5 adult children look to, what does that mean for themselves? What does it mean to step into my father's work? And can I do it? Am I too afraid to do it? What am I going to have to give up? What am I going to have to process through? How do I honor my father and at the same time process this invitation that he's given me? So ultimately that's the story. And it kind of you get to see how each child processes it for themselves.
So that's a big topic. When you look at what you're talking about, actually, outside the parable, the idea of joining in God's family business, on sort of a broad scale, what would you say is the family business in God's economy?
I think it's really simple. I think we go back to the night, the Easter night, right? The second part of that Easter story. Yeah, the resurrection, but then that appearance back in the room to his disciples where he says, hey, I am sending you. You are going to be my witnesses. And so God's work is to reconcile the world to himself, to have each of us live out a life of his love and compassion and care, and to spread the good news that he is Lord and Savior to the ends of the earth, both in our own neighborhoods as well as all across the world. So in a nutshell, that's God's work as far as I'm concerned.
And you know what? I think you're right. I think it is that simple, yet it expresses itself in so many different ways. I know some people default to this mentality that to really be doing the family business, to be doing God's work full time, means what I think of as vocational ministry. It's what I do. In other words, it's what I do as a job. But I really think that the bigger calling is to be in God's business, whatever your vocation. And that's where I think a lot of people miss some opportunity, because they think, okay, I'm a teacher, or I'm in IT, or I'm in sales, and then they try to figure out, well, now how do I do God's business while I'm doing I've got my work over here, but God's business is over here. And really, shouldn't it be that wherever we're at, we're in God's business, which requires learning how to integrate properly the two, our income business and our calling?
Absolutely, Randy. It's not an uncommon posture. In fact, we've done research on this, but it's not an uncommon posture that people see these as two separate things. I've got my sacred life, if you will, and my secular life. Mm-hmm. Is some of the times the way people think about it. But more than anything, what we've realized is that even inside the church, in my own background, I've spent time as a pastor, and also my years with mission service and different ministries. And one of the things that I've learned as I've really kind of backtracked through some of the messages that I've shared from the stage, from the pulpit, as well as others, is we sometimes inadvertently use words that sets up this idea. We talk about this idea of mission field. And sometimes we use that as a way of, it's almost as if there's a place you're supposed to live as a part of God's mission and some place where you don't. And so we talk about this idea of short-term missionaries or long-term missionaries. And yet at the same time, each and every one of us who was created by God was created for his purposes in the world. Mm-hmm. We're all a part of his mission. Mm-hmm. So there's really no such thing as a short-term or long-term, except maybe in where you are serving at the time and how you're serving. But we sometimes in our own language have been communicating this separation between my Christian identity and my secular vocational identity. And you're absolutely right. We've got to do a better job of recognizing that God created me with unique skills and passions and experiences, and I can bring all of that to the table for his ministry. It may not be with my hands and feet all the time if I'm doing certain types of vocational work, but with my mouth, with my heart, with the way that I lead people, with the way that I speak to my customers, with the way that I interact with my neighbors, I am absolutely always a part of God's mission, hopefully for the benefit of his kingdom.
You know, the idea of wholeness is integration, and we see that in some of the Greek language in the Bible. And I think when we separate them the way that we tend to do, a lot of people tend to do, whether it's intentional or just we hadn't really thought about it, it results in a disintegration of our spiritual and our physical, And I think that leads to a lot of confusion and breakdown and ineffectiveness in both areas, frankly. And what I hear you is you're calling us to integrate all aspects of our life for God's kingdom. And I think you're so onto something and so right. But you mentioned research. You did some research. There was some research that impacted your message in this book. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Operation Mobilization, as a ministry, we've been what might be considered to be a mission sending agency for over 60 years, based in the United Kingdom, which is why we spell mobilization with the S instead of the Z.
The Z.
We do have an office here in Tyrone, in Georgia, just outside Atlanta, our U.S. office, and they use the Z spelling. But one of the things that we have discovered is that even though there are something like 2.2 to 2.4 billion, with a B, professing Jesus followers in the world, now that's a lot of people, right? And that's of some tribe. I mean, anything from Roman Catholic to Baptist to Pentecostal to different Protestant. I mean, it's all over the map. But roughly 2.2 to 2.4 billion people. Now, when Gordon Conwell University did their own research, they identified that actually it's less than 0.1% of existing professing Jesus followers who are actually involved in cross-cultural mission. Less than 0.1%. And so here we sit with this mandate from our Savior that says, go into all the world. And less than 0.1% of Jesus followers are actually doing that part with their full lives. And so we had to ask why. Why is that? And so that's where our research kicked in. We sat down in focus groups with Jesus followers in 7 different countries of the world, and we listened, sometimes painfully, to Jesus follower after Jesus follower telling us, telling the moderator, I should say, in the focus groups, just all the excuses, reasons, and fears that are stopping them from getting involved in God's mission with their full life. And so that's sort of the root of the book itself. In the United States, as an example, so globally, there are 3 types of fears that came to the top of the list. Fear of, we call it, one is fear of failure. So fear that I'm going to do it wrong, or maybe I don't feel like I'm equipped enough to do this, right? We can think back to Moses' example around that. Fear of safety, sometimes physical safety. If I feel like I'm going to a war-torn country, someplace where maybe my physical safety would be put at risk, or the safety of my family, but also emotional safety, sometimes in our own neighborhoods. I've got a great relationship with my neighbor. If I start inviting them to church, if I start talking about prayer requests, they're going to look at me funny. And I just feel like I'm in my safe bubble here, and I want to leave it that way. I want to leave well enough alone, right? And the third, and honestly the one that came out 3 times higher than anything else in the United States, was what we call the fear of sacrifice, which is simply stated as the fear of what I'm going to have to give up to step into this lifestyle. If I'm going to give my full self to God, everything, then I'm going to have to give something up. I'm going to have to give things up. And we, as an American public, struggle with that. We just do. So that's the research that I'm talking about. We called it the mission gap research, because there is this gap between what we Christians know we're supposed to do and what we actually do. And so mission gap research is what led us to this knowledge.
Couple of questions on that. Number one, you said 7 countries. Were these mainly Western countries? You weren't talking about Christians in Iran or China, right?
Not yet. That's the next wave. But we had some of this research so the countries were the U.S., Australia, Germany, Hong Kong, Ghana, Brazil, and Chile. Okay. And so we actually hit every, 6 continents, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting part about, as a deeper dive, is that the fear of safety fear of sacrifice was top on the list in the U.S. Fear of failure was top on the list in Ghana. They were just afraid, most Ghanaian Christians were afraid they might do it wrong or not feel like they're well equipped for it. But the idea of having sacrifice to jump into God's mission wasn't the problem.
Now, the other question, just for clarity, is when you say jumping into God's mission, you're talking about leaving your home to go on a mission field, or you're talking about just doing it where you're at home?
I would say both and.
Okay.
The reality is, if you're not a fully alive follower of Jesus in your own neighborhood, in your own community, in your own backyard, you're certainly not going to turn that switch on when you go overseas somewhere. It's not just going to magically happen for you. It's a lifestyle, right?
Yeah, but I do think that with some people, it might actually be easier, because I don't know these people over here in Ghana or wherever I'm at, and so I have less to lose personally, as opposed to my neighbors, where I got to live with them. I got everything to lose. So I don't know. It's interesting. Anyway, but finish your point.
Yeah, no, Randy, you're exactly right. I think that there is some truth in that. I think the other part of this, though, is the reality is we've seen, after decades and decades of Western missionaries going around the world, one of the things we've noticed is that Western missionaries often lack a few very core things. We lack what we call sustainability, meaning am I going to be able to be here long term?
Right.
Do I have the finances? Can I be equipped to do that? We also sometimes talk about the idea of having an authority, right? Why are you here? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm here just because I'm a missionary. Well, but you're not a part of the workforce. I'm not going to your wood shop every day to get some woodworking done. I'm not going to you as a mechanic. You're not a part of my society. So those are the things that when we're doing God's mission in our own backyard, don't require any explanation, right? I'm just here because I work here. My family's down the road. I've been here my life. I speak the language. I know the culture. It's instantly easier for me to communicate the gospel message to people that speak my language, that I live around. There's a lot of those extra hurdles like you were talking about, but it's also it's much more likely that someone's going to hear it from me because they see my lifestyle. And I guess that's part of the other piece of it. Research says that something like 86% of Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, etc., who come to faith, 86% do it because they see someone demonstrating the life of Christ. Yeah. It's not just about the words, right? Yeah. This was my neighbor, this was my friend, and it's that full lifestyle that they've seen someone stepping into.
I think with a lot of people where they're at, they're afraid to because their neighbors know them. It's like and that does calls for us to live the way we're called to live consistently, daily. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I want to show people a few things. Number one is om.org. This is Operation Mobilization's website. If you're in the U.S., it'll take you to omusa.org. All you have to remember is the letter O, the letter M, as in mobilize.org, and that's the website for the organization that our guest, Geoff Peters, works with in a leadership position there. This is the website for the book, The Family Business, the Parable. In fact, the URL is thefamilybusinessparable.com. And we encourage you, if you want to get the book, we encourage you to go to thefamilybusinessparable.com. It will take you to biblestore.com, and you can get the book anywhere you get books. That's fine. But if you do it through this website, which goes through biblestore.com, it'll benefit the organization more than some other secular organization that may not be aligned with all of your values. These people are. So to me, that's a good little reason to go through the trouble of ordering it through a place you may not have ordered before. So, again, we're talking to Geoff Peters, and this is you can see it right. You can see it in the URL there on thefamilybusinessparable.com, but show you a close-up. That's it. The Family Business, a Parable. And when we talk about, Geoff, this idea of people not feeling qualified, that, I think, is legitimate in a lot of cases. If, especially, we approach it from the gospel depends on me, in the sense of I have to do it right. And I'm not advocating doing it wrong, but I suspect that you have some insight into the qualification aspect of it for all of us who are ultimately disqualified from any kind of perfection. But that's the beauty of Christ, in that we don't qualify ourselves; He qualifies us. How do we go forward with confidence in our own backyard, where we live right now, to share the gospel when we feel unqualified or even disqualified by our past?
Yeah. You know, we can look to Moses as, I think, a great example of this. Here's someone who had a definite calling from God for a specific purpose. And he was uniquely shaped, right? He was from both cultures, if you will. And yet he felt completely unqualified. But the more he stepped into the work that he was called to do, the more he suited up and played the game, right? He saw how God was walking with him. And I think that's an example for us all as we consider stepping into a life. We need to know that God is going to be with us. And we can look to those unique skills and giftings and passions that God has placed in us in order to be a part of this work. I have one example that comes to mind. I have a good friend of mine. Now he has suffered in he's suffering with alcoholism for quite some time. He's been in recovery now for over 20 years. But because of his life, because of the way he has been formed and transformed by God, there are people that he can speak with who are much more eager and able to receive a message of hope and love from him than they would be from me, someone who has not walked that journey. And so there are pieces of our life that God says, bring that to the table. We have a horrible history, I think, oftentimes of saying, fantastic, you're an engineer, you're a doctor, you're a teacher, you're a nurse, that's wonderful. If you want to serve God, now you're going to be a pastor or a church planter. And as if it has to be one or the other. But we've seen time and time again, I can tell you how many doctors and nurses I know who have actually taken their job and said, you know what, I got skills. I can get into some of these countries and places around the world that a missionary can't go. Mm-hmm. But I can go apply for a job to be a doctor or a nurse or an engineer or a mechanic in a part of the world where Christians are few and far between and where there aren't many churches around. And I can be the light of Christ in one of these places. I can get in because I have a job. I'm going to go do it. And so it's about connecting, bringing what God has put in you and finding that creative way of being a part of his mission, using the tools that ultimately are from him, the gifts, right? We're just stewarding those resources. We're not the owner anyway. So in many ways, it's about, using what God has gifted you for his purposes to do the work he's called you to do.
So you mentioned one individual friend of yours who is able to reach alcoholics because he's struggled with alcoholism, and therefore they will listen to him. And that is true. I get that. But for other people who may be the doctors, engineers, nurses, teachers, whatever, who are not necessarily leaving to go overseas, because you're exactly right about that, by the way. And if God's calling you to do that, go. But for those who have decided, you know what, I'm going to make my office where I work my mission field. Have you seen some people that have decided, I'm going to just be a missionary right where I'm at because God's already put me here, and seen it transform lives?
Absolutely. And it's interesting, when it's local, we don't call it missionary work, we just call it being a disciple, right? I think that's just an interesting division we make when someone goes overseas. In my own neighborhood, I'm just being a Christian, right? Right. And so, yeah, absolutely. We've seen, doctors' offices that allow people to, if you want to be open about the ailment you have, you can post a prayer concern on this board. I've talked to people who said, the best way for me to step into this, I send encouraging notes to my coworkers, to my boss from time to time. And when they say, why did you do that? I say, well, it's part of my faith. It opens a door. I mean, it's just about looking for those opportunities to share Christ's love and light with the people right around you, and starting small sometimes. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes we see missionaries and we're like, wow, that's great. And it is great. But, you got to be faithful in the little things before you're going to be called to do the big things. And I think that's where sometimes we overlook it, not intentionally. We overlook the opportunities that are right in front of us. The idea of loving your neighbor, I like the literal translation in there of love your near one as yourself. You go, well, who's your near one? Well, who's near you? I mean, it may be the waiter or waitress at lunch today. It's definitely your family. It's definitely literally your next door neighbors. Even though I lived next to a neighbor for years and had no idea their names. But anyway, you got people around you, coworkers. You got people that are in your life. They're all your near ones, and so I think if we can just get the vision that you lay out in your parable, the family business, we'll start to see the opportunities that God's already putting in front of us.
Yeah, Randy, you're right.
I was going to pull up the OM website again because I want, before I let you go, to give you the opportunity to share a little bit more about what your organization does, if I can get the right cues there. There it is, om.org, because we alluded to this, but what exactly is it that you are engaged in full-time as a part of this organization?
So my role as a part of OM, I serve as a part of the international leadership team. And my role is basically storytelling. I loved being involved with helping to tell the story of what God is doing through the work of OM around the world. It's we serve in 120 countries. We're 120 countries made up of over 110 nationalities, if you can believe that. I mean, we're a fairly diverse group globally, and we've got over 6,000 people who sort of serve connected to OM, but countless others who are just involved in our mission, in our cause, so to speak, which is God's mission and God's cause. And maybe they've had a training or they've been equipped somehow through OM, but that is our work. We come alongside disciples and try to help you as a Jesus follower learn how to share God's love in new ways. And especially our special emphasis, if you will, is those parts of the world where churches and Jesus followers are few and far between. Okay. There are, by some estimates, upwards of 3 billion people in the world today who live in a community, in a neighborhood where they will not naturally encounter a Christian. There is no church nearby. And so our definite bias is helping to equip existing Christians for that to the ends of the earth mission that God has put right at the center of our work.
So you're saying you work in New York City? That's what I want. No, that was not nice at all. I apologize to my Christian friends in New York City. There's some wonderful Christians and churches up there. Sorry, sometimes I go off script. Geoff, thank you. Is there anything else you want to mention about the book or about the organization that I didn't give you a chance to say?
No, I think you said it all, Randy. I mean, thefamilybusinessparable.com, that is, you can get it, as you said, from any place. But I did want to touch on one last thing. You alluded to this idea of the neighbor, and sometimes it's more difficult to share the gospel with my neighbor. And if people know that I'm a Christian, maybe they're going to look at me differently. And there's actually one character in the book who faces that dilemma head on. So I'll leave that as a teaser, if you will. But The Family Business is the book, and it'd be a blessing to have folks pick it up.
All right, I'm going to show you guys the website again. Geoff, thank you. I appreciate all that you're doing as an organization, as an individual, and as a writer. And I get nonfiction books sent to me every day, all the time, and I'm bent towards fiction. So this is like a special privilege. So I appreciate the creativity in the parable. So thank you. That's a little aside. That was free. Thank you. But all that you're doing, I do appreciate it, and appreciate your time here on Life Today Live.
Great to be with you.
Good to be with all you guys out there. I'll throw these in the chat as I exit here, but you can check out the websites. The familybusinessparable.com is going to look like that. It'll take you to biblestore.com, a great place to get the book, as well as om.org. And you can do it. You can be a missionary, and it's when it's at home, like Geoff said, we just call it being a disciple. And that's ultimately what we're all called to do. So go do it. Start today. God will qualify you as you step out in obedience and in faith. He'll equip you. Don't worry about it. You can do it. Go do it. And come back tomorrow for more Life Today Live. We'll see you again next time.
What you